Good morning, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And I'm here today with a Research Associate for the Learning Network, Dr. Robert Nonamura. And we are so pleased to be bringing you this webcast today, Full Disclosure, Implications for Individuals Who Disclose Sexual Violence in the University Context. And I know it's going to be valuable to people, whether they're in a university or a college, just any post-secondary, I think, institution. There will be benefit from this webcast today. To start, wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands, and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. As settlers, we commit to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. The webcast, as many of you know, is a newer series that we've introduced. And where our webinars are an hour and 15 minutes, the webcast series are an hour. So we will go from 11 till 12 today. We will have our presenters present and then stop so that there's time for questions that we can present to you, our presenters, and get their response. Today's webcast is presented by Dr. Jenn and Hayley Moody. And before I introduce Jenn and Hayley, I just want to go through our webcast format for today. First of all, right off the bat, Sarah sent to everybody who registered a copy of the presenter's slides. So hopefully you received those. If not, there will also be a link in the chat box that you can access them if you would like to print them while you're listening to our presenters. Jenn and Hayley are going to present for 45 minutes approximately. And during their presentation, we want you to enter any questions or comments that you have into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And during the last 15 minutes or so of the webcast, then Robert and I will present as many of those questions as we can for our presenters to respond. At the end of the webcast, in the chat box, you'll see a link to the evaluation. And again, we need your input because it helps us plan for future webcasts. And once you complete the evaluation form, you'll be directed to a web page where you'll be prompted to enter your name and email. And then that will allow a certificate of participation to be generated and emailed to you. And I just want to stress that when you put your name in, that is not connected to the evaluation that you've just completed. So the evaluations are anonymous, but your name is just linked to the generation of the certificate. So the webcast recording will be posted on our website within the next week or so for people who want to refer to it and for people who registered but weren't able to attend or got interrupted during the presentation. And so Sarah sends out a link, Sarah Mohammed, and so that everybody gets a link who registered to the site on our website. I'm repeating the word site a lot here, so that you can access it. So with all of that looked after, we want to introduce our speakers. And I'm going to start with Jennifer Root. Jennifer is an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University, and also a registered social worker. Her approach to scholarship and practice is rooted in advocacy, community-driven methods, anti-oppressive and intersectional feminist theories, Prior to joining the Faculty of Social Work, Jennifer worked alongside various communities across Canada and the United States, doing anti-violence prevention and intervention work, primarily on issues related to women's experiences of intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, and sexual violence. More recently, her work explores the impacts of gender-based violence on students, including the disclosure process as experienced by post-secondary instructors. Hayley Moody is a queer, two-spirited Anishinaabe with roots from the French River area, England and Germany, and currently lives along the Haldeman Tract in Brantford. Most of her work has centered around sexual violence advocacy and working with youth in a counseling and support role. Always, Hayley prioritizes healing as an act of resistance. She spends a lot of her time being critical of the Canadian colonial state and dreaming of land reclamation and youth-led revolutions. And I have to say that Hayley reached out to us and initiated discussions that led to this webcast today on behalf of her team. And we're really grateful to her for that. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Jennifer and Hayley.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks for such a warm welcome. And hello to the folks watching at home or online or in your offices. So I'm Jennifer, this is Hayley. We wanted to start by just welcoming folks, letting you know that we're here to spend the next 40-ish, 45 minutes. We'll try to be briefer than normal to allow for as many questions as possible, and look forward to hearing your questions. I also appreciated, and thank you, Linda, for giving a bit of a land acknowledgement to start us off. And we as a team wanted to do our own acknowledgement as well. We're here in Brantford. We're on the Brantford campus of the Laurier University, and as mentioned in Hayley's bio, along the Haldeman Tract. And that's home to the traditional peoples of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral folks. And being on this land, for those of us who are settlers, was something that came up immediately in our work as a research team in terms of this project. As we sat down to start thinking about how we wanted to do and engage in this critical analysis of policies inside of the post-secondary landscape, inside of the university context, Hayley quite rightly pointed out that we were engaging in a process where we wanted to look at how policies dealt with things like fairness and transparency and consent and wanting to eliminate violence. And how can we expect that of policies, or is it realistic to expect that of policies who exist from institutions who exist by virtue of colonization and who continue to be part of the ongoing colonial project. And so that was always at the forefront of our thinking and how we thought about these policies very critically. So we wanted to, again, acknowledge the land, but also know that it was really kind of at the foundation of our work and thinking through how we went about looking at contradictions, looking for different collisions of discourses, that always at the heart of it was knowing it all started from a colonial place.
So just before we get started into this larger conversation, I'm just going to provide a little bit of objectives and context of what we're doing here. So for the most part, we just want to provide survivors and people who support survivors with information about Ontario University sexual violence and or gender-based violence policies. So we're a research team that went through sexual violence policies from across Ontario, and we have some findings that we want to share. So we want to emphasize the sites of contradiction in the policies that may unintentionally limit survivor control over disclosure and or reporting and or complaint procedures. So we're kind of looking at this from an informed consent perspective, where it's like we're just going to highlight some of the things that we notice, some of the trends, some of the common themes that were happening throughout all of the policies, just to be able to highlight some information that is important for survivors to know, or for folks who support survivors to know before entering into these processes.
So by way of background, we're going to spend a little bit of time going back and forth in this presentation, both to sort of anchor you to the research study proper, the kind of work we did in terms of scholarly or academic work, and then trying to make the distinction around the information we thought would be most useful to folks who are doing direct service work, frontline type of work. But before we get to that, I do want to acknowledge that we do talk about ourselves as a team. So Hayley and I are here on behalf of our research team, which also consists of Dr. Rebecca Godress. She's an associate professor here at Laurier. And then our important community partners. So part of Hayley's introduction didn't mention that she also used to hold a position here at Laurier. She was a sexual violence counselor and advocate for just over four years, and currently works as a project coordinator not only with our project, but as part of the LGBTQ Youth Helpline in Ontario as the Southern Coordinator. Did I get that right?
Correct.
We also work closely with Joanna Brant. She's part of our team. She's the executive director of our local sexual assault center. And Sonia Marai, she is also someone who worked with us, who holds multiple positions in terms of, she's a limited term instructor here at Laurier, a PhD student, and also does frontline social work practice here in Brantford. We also, of course, want to acknowledge that our project, like I said, the research project proper was supported by SSHRC Research funding, which we're always grateful for. And we'll talk a little bit more again about the research project as we move forward. And again, we wanted to sort of ground this work and recognize that, of course, we're not the first folks to be doing this work. There were generations of scholars who have come before us, folks who have done really important, groundbreaking work around looking at impacts of violence, how that comes into the policy arena, how systems are constructed around policy, and then how that actually rolls out and affects people in real ways. So certainly we want to contribute to that work. We hope that this work might be helpful to folks who are currently doing this type of research, and perhaps into the future for those who are going to come long after we stop doing this work, that people will continue to sort of pick up the mantle.
So before we get into the actual research results and the things that we wanted to share with you folks, we just had two questions for everyone that's on this webinar right now, just to give us some more information about like who's listening, who's with us today. And this information isn't going into our research. It's not part of our research. We're not like holding on to this information. It's just for our own context so that we can maybe even like tailor some of the information that we're sharing to who folks are. So this is the first question that popped up here on the screen. So it's please describe your connection to the post-secondary institution nearest to your community, and you can check all that apply. So we'll just wait a couple of seconds for folks to go through that question.
Yeah, we find it helps to be able to know whether or not to spend more time on the academic bits, more time on the sort of practical elements of the presentation. So we appreciate if folks are comfortable to kind of share your role. That's helpful for us. So now, my sense is maybe there's something blinking at me. Just give me a sec.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we are.
Yay.
So folks should, my hope is folks should be able to see the poll results just as we are. And it seems that there's quite a few frontline staff online, which is wonderful. So we're able to tell that we have a fairly good balance after that in terms of student, other folks, administrators, some faculty instructors, and community folks. Which is wonderful.
Awesome.
I'm just going to jot a little note to ourselves there so we have a sense of the majority. Thanks, folks, for giving us that information. That's really helpful.
Yeah, it actually looks like the majority of folks are people that are coming from like frontline.
So we can probably move on to our second question.
Yeah.
So we're just hanging on to our back-end support there to help us move to our second question around university policy. And if that's Sarah who's working her magic in the background, thank you.
Yay. So question number 2. So my post-secondary institution's policy meets the needs of all survivors who study or work on my campus. So this is a multiple choice question, so just select one.
Here comes the results, it looks like. Feels like we're at the Oscars, waiting for the waiting for the response. Neutral, interesting. So a lot of folks have sort of unsure in terms of where your policy lands in terms of being more helpful or perhaps unknowingly harmful. But still some folks with a spectrum of replies. So I'm just gonna also give us just a little note to see where folks are at. So thank you for to everyone who participated in the poll. That's really helpful to kind of keep us moving forward and know how to sort of tailor some of our information.
Next to it there. Okay, so again, we have some questions that we actually want to we want you folks to keep in mind as we move through this. So it's not just like a passive exercise, but just questions to keep in mind about your home location or your home policy, the context that you live and work in. So where does my university policy sit/position itself in relation to the information presented today? And that's for folks too, if you don't necessarily work at a university, just like the university or the post-secondary institution that might be closest to you, folks that you might be supporting there. How is my university's policy similar or different? And what, if anything, do I want to do about my university's sexual violence, gender-based violence policy if these themes resonate with my own experience and or understanding? So just keeping these in mind as we move through, and that includes for folks that might be outside of Ontario, because I know that there might have been some people who are coming from across Canada, maybe even from the US. So yeah, just keeping these questions in the back of your mind as we kind of move through the themes that we picked out from our selection of Ontario universities.
And we wanted to forefront those questions to you all because we just have a few more things we wanted to offer before we start to actually get into some of the details and the study findings. And it relates to the questions Hayley just asked folks to hold in your mind. And that's because we're not planning to provide, and we had a lot of questions before this webcast sent to us, and thank you to the folks who reached out to ask for more information. But folks were really curious to know if we would be doing any best practices or making recommendations or suggestions for where folks can make changes. And we just wanted to let folks know early on that we're not going to be doing that as part of our presentation today. And that is somewhat intentional on our behalf. We're not interested in sort of making suggestions because we know that these policies are context specific. We know they're time and place specific. And we know that there are lots of different things we need to do in our post-secondary context to meet the needs of survivors and those who are working with survivors. So that's why we're hoping what you might be able to do is sort of listen to the findings of our study and think more about how this may or may not relate to your context, how your policies may or may not sound like the kind of things we're talking about here in terms of patterns and themes. The other thing we wanted to offer and put out there for folks to think about, again, before we start getting into some of the material, is that we are, and I would say the majority of us on our research team consider ourselves critical researchers, or folks who do critical types of research. And in fact, for the academic folks who are online or the research-minded folks, we did a critical discourse analysis in terms of the methodology we used. So that, by the very nature of doing critical research, that means we are not at a starting point satisfied with the status quo. We intentionally went into this process as critical researchers to look for those gaps, to look for the unspoken things, to look for contradiction, to look for when things are said but kind of unclear, to look for the subtext. And so when we do that, when that kind of work as researchers, when we're critical of how things look in terms of the text, in terms of how things are formulated, in terms of how they're put together, that can sometimes be heard by folks as being critical of the people or critical critical of the effort that went into these policies. So we just want to say that that's not our intention. And in fact, folks on our team have been deeply involved in the policy development at our own universities. And we are all implicated in some ways in terms of how the complications of these policies play out, the both unknown and known consequences of policy when they're enacted for folks. So it's our genuine intention that we hope people are able to hear this critical research as critical of the text, as critical of the policy as written, and that's not meant to sort of in any way diminish or take away from or deride the really important work that folks are doing on the front lines at the administrative level. That this isn't a measure of an intention by any means. We are trying to talk about how the language and the text actually points to different possibilities for folks. And finally, in that same spirit, this is a research project, obviously funded through SSHRC funds. So we did engage in an academic exercise, but for the 5 of us on this team, this isn't just an academic exercise. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is, but for all of us, we have engaged in some sort of, and continue to engage in some sort of direct support work with students on campus, or with the folks who are supporting students on campus. And so we do have not the same stake perhaps as survivors and people who directly support survivors every day as their paid position, but we're here in a different way, and it does mean more to us than simply providing access to new knowledge or to different ways of thinking about things in terms of a research project. So for all of that, we hope that that provides a little bit of a sense of who we are as a research team and sort of our intentionality in going into this process, and what we hope you'll take away from this in terms of the outcomes of this webcast. That if nothing else, as we kind of say in that upper right bubble, we hope you'll be able to walk away with some information that you can take back to your own institution, to your own policies, and sort of think about where this might be true and where it might not be true for you in terms of the way your policy is actually written in terms of the text. So, and as a researcher, I happen to find the nuts and bolts of the research project very interesting, but I understand that for all folks, you're not here to get a research methods class, but I do just want to really briefly run through the research project proper, like I said, in terms of doing a critical discourse analysis and some of the strategies we use to get at the information we're going to be sharing with you. So this project builds from a previous research project Dr. Rebecca Godress and I conducted here at Laurier. We wanted to look at faculty receipt of student disclosures. So as faculty members, who are in different faculties, by the way, Dr. Godress and I don't belong to the same faculty, we seem to be receiving, and continue to receive a lot of disclosures from students that we engage with. And we came to start thinking about, well, we can't be the only ones. Who else is engaging with students? What do they make of it? How does that inform their teaching, their pedagogy? Do they respond positively, negatively? So from that study, that small study, we started to think about, I wonder how our policies direct faculty. What sort of directives or ideas do they have about when faculty are receiving disclosures from students, what's to be done about it? So that led us to this project in terms of wanting to do a careful analysis of how faculty show up in our sexual violence policies on campus. And we very quickly learned that we don't really, like in terms of faculty members, if you were to do a keyword search in the policy for the term faculty or instructor, it's a very benign concept. There's not much in there. And we don't have a comment on that either way, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But what the other piece of this research we wanted to do was think about what are the discourses that are really coming together to form up and shape this idea of disclosure? Like, what are we really talking about when we design a policy around student disclosure? And so that's how we entered into this project. Like I said, doing a critical discourse analysis. We chose a small sample of publicly available mid-sized universities across Ontario that had been developed after Bill 32. And we as a group read across these policies individually and as a group, spending upwards of, at the low end averaged around 50+ hours spent with this sample of policies. And so as we were reading with an eye towards that critical discourse analysis, so we're doing a true CDA, sort of informed by Fair Close work. We also, because we are frontline service folks, and we are folks who have done this work on the ground, on the side of our minds, we were also saying to one another, are you seeing this? Why is this so hard to read? Do you think survivors know this? This seems to be saying something that suggests one thing, but could be taking up another way. And we kept having these little moments where we would say to one another, something's happening here. And do you think people realize this is a possibility? So as we were doing our critical discourse analysis, we also started to keep track of this kind of more practical, I don't know what you would call it, but the kind of information we thought, wow, I wonder if this would be useful in the hands of survivors or folks who are supporting survivors. Like, do folks really understand that this is in the policy? So as we began to document that, we began to notice themes and patterns across the policies in the sample. So that's what we're here to talk about today. The CDA findings proper will be published in a different forum, a different place, a peer-reviewed journal. So if folks are interested in learning more about how we plan to talk about the collision of discourses, that there actually are discourses at play in these policies, human rights discourses and legal discourses, and how those come together. That's a separate piece of work that, again, will be made available. But for right now, we've used that study to sort of begin talking about the patterns we also discovered as we were moving through this process as a group.
So that brings us to our findings. I feel like that was a lot of preamble. We just
I'm sorry.
went into like, no, not just on your part, like our
Yeah.
entire slideshow, but we really wanted to provide all of that context before we jump into the 4 main themes that we wanted to share with you. And as Jen mentioned too, as we were going through the policies, we were noticing, as like frontline people, we were noticing things that, I mean, just in general, how difficult the policies were to read and how difficult they are to understand. And so really picking out the key points that we thought that survivors or folks who support survivors, but we thought it might be helpful for them to know. So as was stated before, again, we're going to provide these findings based on the text and the policies, but we're not going to go into like best practices or how this could be changed or if we think it should be changed at all, actually. We just want to present these findings as they're found in the policies. So that it might be helpful for folks. And again, going back into like informed consent, like for folks who are accessing these policies, I feel like it might be really helpful to have some of these basics that might be buried in like, you know, the 13th page and under a little tiny heading. So that was kind of how we saw this work as like valuable, and we didn't want to just do research for the sake of doing research, because academia. But
and I also remember Hayley saying, and I remember saying to Hayley, if you had just started your position as a support worker, sexual violence advocate and counselor inside of university, do you feel like you would be able to navigate these policies? Do you feel like there would be clear indications to you of the things you should be sharing with survivors, or would you know where to go for certain information? And we weren't so sure all the time. So we also just wondered for folks who are new to positions in their universities, who are just beginning to sort of navigate and learn about the different sort of pathways and how their policy is enacted in their context, if this might be just another way to sort of signal, hey, you might want to look a little bit closer at your own policy to think about how these things lay out for you.
And just to provide, again, that information up front to folks that you might be supporting about just like the 4 main things that we see anyways, that we feel like people should know before they make a choice, if they can make a choice about entering into these policies.
The first one?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so the first one is confidentiality is not protected in the same ways as other helping supports. So as most folks know, there is like 3 standard confidentiality rules type thing, standards. I guess, like standards that are typically used for social services, but also I just think for humans in general around holding on to confidentiality. So those 3 things are imminent harm to self, imminent harm to someone else, or current harm to someone under the age of 16. So those are just like the standards that all of us have come to know. But when looking through the policies, those things are definitely stated. But for all the policies that we reviewed, there are kind of like catch-all phrases or little caveats that it's like, these are the grounds as to which confidentiality might be broken, but also all of these things too. So for example, where these red little circles that are highlighted, these are snapshots of the policies. So for example, university officials require information for the purposes of implementing this policy. So that like the bottom one where it's the little 3 sign, that was actually included under limits to confidentiality. So again, that feels kind of like a catch-all phrase where it's like, these are the limits, but also there's other limits as well. There's another one up at the top there. So again, another limit to confidentiality. A non-anonymous complaint has been filed and thus would be shared to a limited number of people directly involved with the processing the complaint or accommodation. So again, there's like little phrasing in there where it's like, it's for a lot of them, it seems to be very clear around the first 3 limits to confidentiality, but then throughout the policies, there's kind of like little tidbits of information that suggest that confidentiality might be broken in numerous other ways. And these are just 3 screenshots that actually stated it through policies like multiple times, not just once, around these catch-all phrases where it's like confidentiality is upheld unless this needs to happen.
And I think for folks who may not, or who are used to interacting with someone like a physician or a social worker, or other types of helping supports like Hayley described, our sort of threshold for breaching confidentiality is extremely high. So if you're thinking about how that might differ in the context of a university, you might want to think about looking to your policy to see what are sort of those extra kind of beyond that first threshold Hayley described, those sort of additional moments when confidentiality could be breached. Because I think that's something that might be important, again, on the front end to let if you're working with survivors, or if you're a survivor thinking about how to navigate some of this, that there could be ways that confidentiality will be breached. And again, it's often different for every policy that we had a look at. I think too, we'll touch a little bit more on confidentiality when we also talk about some findings we had around privacy, because sometimes those 2 things are often conflated, but they are slightly different. I'm going to move along now to the next pattern or theme, for lack of a better word, that we started to realize when we were moving through the policy analysis. And we use strong language here around disclosure can be forced into a formal report/complaint. Again, the language used around what these things are is different by policy. But what these policies tend to do when we looked at them as a sample, often we're very careful to make clear distinctions between what a disclosure is and what a report/complaint might be, meaning that they were trying to make very clear distinctions around a disclosure often being very informal, something that you might do if you wanted to access some supportive services or accommodation, something that need not sort of be formal in the investigative sense. So when policies started to qualify things as a report or a complaint, that often meant that, again, the system was moving into more of an investigative sort of route, trying to determine if disciplinary action is required. And again, the policies oftentimes tried to say these are very distinct things, and folks who access the policy will have an option to sort of pursue those kind of very different pathways. When in fact what we ended up finding was, again, these were when we sort of had these moments during our meetings where we were reading that, did you just read that you can actually be forced into a report at any time, that it's at the discretion of the university, that things can move forward with or without the consent of the survivor, that there are concerns that supersede the need for something to remain a disclosure? And in fact, that's what we started to find. So in these screenshots, you'll see there are, and again, different across policies, the extent of the kind of level in terms of whether a university or institution will take over or take a disclosure into a report pathway. But there are certainly times where there are policies that if there is a concern, for example, for public safety, or if there's a concern about some sort of greater good or potential sort of legal ramification, that there are clauses in policy that talk about moving forward with a complaint or an investigation with or without the consent of the survivor. And again, it's not so much that we have a comment on that, It's more so that we think that it's important, or that it would be really helpful to, if you're working with a survivor, to let these folks know on the front end that that could be an eventuality. It might be a very small eventuality. It could be it's never happened in your particular institution, but I think that there can be a real reduction of harm, or a real possibility to sort of reduce the sort of a potential crisis moment if people know this on the front end before they start to, determine how they want to engage with the policy, whether it be more of a disclosure pathway or a reporting pathway, knowing that they're not as distinct as it might sort of be the intention of the policy. Especially in those terminology sections, or those preamble sections of policy, they really do try to make that distinction. But there does become a point where they often become quite muddied when you look at the procedures and the way the policies can be enacted. You could cover that one well.
Yeah, that's great.
So we'll move on to our third pattern here. And these are going to be a series of images, and maybe we'll go back and forth between Hayley and I. So we just want to prepare folks. And again, this is similar to the previous pattern. The idea that as a survivor, someone who perhaps has not engaged supportive services before, or who's entering into this kind of resource relationship for the first time, needing some support or accommodation, it's not unreasonable to think that, I'm going to share my story with someone. Maybe that person has to share their story with their supervisor or a team, but the likelihood of it going much beyond that, it's a contained experience. I don't think that's an unrealistic idea for people to hold. And again, especially if they've not really engaged in a lot of supportive services before. So we think it's important, and we noticed this right away in doing our readings, that a person's disclosure or story can really move through the university in very different ways. It can look like what we just described. It could be very contained to a particular team, but again, it can also really move through the university in perhaps unexpected ways. So the first image we're going to show is a bit of a flow chart. And the second image is also a flow chart. So the first one relates to if you just want to imagine a disclosure pathway on its own. So someone who's strictly looking for some supports, maybe some resourcing and accommodation. And the second image we'll go through follows the pathway more of what the policies are describing as a report or a complaint, more of the investigative pathway.
And just to name too how complicated it was, or like how hard of a time we had trying to figure that out for individual policies, but then also as a whole to see like the common themes or trends or offices or people that might be involved in terms of people disclosing or reporting sexual violence. And it's not like in these policies, there was a very clear laid out example of like, if you disclose, this is exactly what's going to happen. It was almost like it was different pieces contained throughout the entirety of the policy. So different offices that are named like on page like 14 that haven't been named previous. So it's kind of like, it was very, very difficult to actually be able to trace this, just to name like how difficult that would be for folks who are survivors and trying to access policies and like understanding these processes, and also for folks who support survivors too. Like it's just like Jenn said, we had like reviewed these policies for so many hours.
And we would actually comment to one another and say, we're intentionally sitting down with a clear mind. We're spending focused time on this. We're trying to engage, and we're still not clear. We're still, so we can imagine how folks who are doing their day-to-day work, doing frontline service work, supporting survivors, doing emotional labor, and it would be really difficult to move through some of these policies and really have a clear idea about what the potentialities are. So again, some of our hope is to kind of maybe, at least if nothing else, create a moment to think about that and go in more carefully with your own policies. So I'm just going to move to this first image. And again, I don't expect in the time of this webcast, folks will be able to really look and engage carefully with these visuals. But our intention was, again, just to kind of visually demonstrate, if you're someone, a survivor, for example, or supporting a survivor at that emergency disclosure or non-emergency disclosure on the left-hand side of this chart, that these are sort of the ways, based on our analysis, we could determine that that story might go, or that disclosure, that person's experience might move through the institution in these ways. And you'll notice at the bottom, the sort of greeny color there, we could determine that was a consistent sort of pathway across our sample. When you move into those sort of blue boxes, that's when we started to find there were inconsistencies across the policies. So very different ways that things could start to move beyond those first green boxes. So again, that's just a signal to us that people will want to spend time thinking about, again, your particular location and context and how your policy sort of deals with its own pathway. And importantly, what we want to do for the takeaway for this is for folks to look at carefully the number of people or offices or groups or teams that have access to a survivor's story, and be able to comment on that when you first start working with someone. Because I think it's important for people to know, or our team really thought it was important for people to know, that there could be, depending on how things flow, maybe upwards of 10 people who might have access to or read about or learn about your story at some point in this process. And so that leads us to wanting to talk about, so this disclosure pathway, again, it's not as distinct as you might think, but for sake of, demonstrating visually, we did create two different sort of charts. So I'm going to move to the chart now that looks more at a disclosure leading to a report. So the idea that you're moving into a pathway of wanting to report an experience of violence. And you can see, and my hope is that, same with those green boxes or greener boxes are sort of the consistent sort of ways all of the policies across our sample laid out in terms of a potential pathway. Blue boxes is when it starts to become inconsistent. It's different across the policies. But again, what we find interesting is, regardless if it's consistent or inconsistent, again, the number of folks, the offices they hold, and again, who sort of might come into the life of the survivor's story, not into the survivor's life, but intersect with their experience of violence, their disclosure, and come into that process. And we noticed things like that we didn't anticipate, for example, the vice president of finance, or perhaps the vice president of administration. There's talk of different external consultants. How many is unknown. The makeup of different teams. Is a team made up of 8 people? Is it made up of 2 people? So just thinking about the sheer number of folks. And when you relate that back to a privacy conversation, I think it's not unrealistic for survivors to expect a certain amount of privacy when they share their story, that they'll have some control over it, they'll have knowledge of how it moves, who knows about it. And there's not really a lot to suggest that that information is readily available on the front end for folks to know about. So again, another just sort of signal to that idea of how can we better prepare folks for the reality that their story might touch, again, depending on the policy or the school, anywhere from 2 to 25 plus people, based on our findings in terms of the high end of, their story being sort of shared across these different offices and locations.
And again, that doesn't mean that this is what this is going to look like for everyone who reports or for everyone who discloses, but just like being able to have that visual layout of what could happen and who could potentially be involved. And like Jen said, just the sheer number of folks and offices, because a lot of these too are like office related and like, or external expert related. And it's like, what does that mean in terms of how many folks are actually involved in that? And another question we had is how that's communicated to the survivor.
Right. Because the policies don't actually, there's some language around, doing our best to keep the survivor apprised, but there's no clear indication, or there's no clear text anyway, that actually documents how the survivor is looped into all of these sort of different potentialities, when, how often, by whom, the frequency. So again, just questions to be thinking about when we're doing that frontline supportive work with folks. So those were the 4 key sort of patterns, or, oh, we have one more. One
more, and I think we have enough time for it.
Perfect.
Okay, so for our last one that we found, I'm actually thinking now, we named it as survivors can experience silencing, but I'm also thinking it encompasses also how survivors aren't in control. So as we know, as folks who are doing frontline work, and as folks, know in general, it is very important for survivors to have levels of control in terms of their story. Like, that just makes sense. But when we were looking through the policies, there's lots of instances where that's not actually going to be the case. So for example, the first quote up there, if the survivor or respondent refuses to participate in any procedures under this policy, the university may proceed in their absence. So again, noting that it says survivor and respondent. So for both folks or both parties, the university policy actually dictates that they can continue with a report or any type of like procedure regardless of what the survivor is wanting in that moment. And there can be lots of different reasons as to why that might happen, but just to name the fact that that is a possibility. So the last quote there too is similar to that. So if a person requests that the university not act on a report of sexual violence, the university must weigh that person's request against the university's legal obligation to take action. So again, just another example that was throughout quite a few of the policies, that there are situations where even if the survivor doesn't wish to go forward with a report, or even if they just thought that they were disclosing and just looking for accommodations or supports, like the university can actually take that and continue with the report, continue with investigation, continue with that process without the actual consent of the survivor. And that's like pretty alarming for us. And then the middle quote there, is just another example of confidentiality and also just like survivors being silenced in the process. So this part is that the investigation report will be provided to the complainant and to the respondent with the reminder of the need to protect and keep confidential the personal information of those involved in the investigation and to avoid acts of reprisal. So the university considers reprisal at any stage to be a serious offense, and a breach of confidentiality by any person with respect to the complaint may also constitute reprisal. So again, this is like a situation where it's like a survivor might not be entirely in control of their story and like what might be happening, because this is for both the survivor and the person who caused harm, where they're not actually allowed to talk about it in particular ways, and that they can actually be punished for that in some situations. So again, that's not to say that this is going to happen every time, and like what does confidentiality look like? What is a breach of confidentiality? I think that that's all context specific, but just to put it out there that that is a possibility, that if a survivor is going through a process, and even if they don't want to go through that process and that choice was taken away from them, they're still under strict guidelines of confidentiality, and they can actually be punished under this policy if they do breach that confidentiality. So again, these are just like examples that we saw throughout the policies of survivors being silenced and or just not in control of the process, which is hard and like it sucks. So it was just like another thing that we wanted to make sure that folks knew, and for survivors to know too.
So moving through those 4 patterns, I think was important, and it brings us actually right to the end. And I know we want to leave time for folks, so we won't belabor the wrap up, but just reiterate that, you know, this is one way to do a policy analysis. This was our critical analysis, and we hope you're able to, like I said, return to your own context, your own policies, and think about how this information is confirmatory for you. Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps you have a different experience altogether. So we are happy to sort of stop talking and hear a little bit more from folks in terms of the questions you might have. We are welcoming that.
Thank you, Jennifer, Jen, and Hayley, very much. So much information, and I must admit it's hard to sort of take it all in some respects. And I'm just wondering, just as a start, I know you were very open in terms of what either yourselves or the team felt surprised by. And I guess I'm wondering, do you have any sense of to what degree service providers in communities who are working with students or members of the university community may be aware of these policy pieces that you've pointed out to us today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's probably going to be like community specific in terms of how much community partners might be working within universities or with students or with faculty or staff in terms of their post-secondary institution, like in their community. But I can also just speak from my own experience as someone, so Jen had mentioned that in my previous role, I was working as a sexual violence counselor and advocate here at Laurier, but I wasn't employed by Laurier. I was actually employed by the Sexual Assault Center to exclusively work with Laurier students. So I technically was a community partner, and that position continues to this day, and is technically a partner and not someone that is embedded in a particular way in the university. And I'll just speak from our perspective. So I think because of how much I was working with students in relation to the policy, I think I grew to an understanding of what to expect in the policy, and that of course informs this research from my perspective anyways, and also Joanna's, who was my supervisor at that time. But also I think back to other folks like my colleagues that were working at the Sexual Assault Center who were also trying to support students from other institutions. So there was a couple of times when I was called into those conversations to support other staff at our Sexual Assault Center in supporting students at other universities or other colleges. Because I think it is, I think that there's, like we said, the policies are hard to read and they can be hard to navigate. And I think from being in that position, I gained a lot of like insight and knowledge from being there. So what I'm trying to say is that would be like context specific in terms of community. It would depend on how much they're working with university folks or post-secondary folks in general, and how much they've had to interact. So, and then there's others who haven't had any interaction, or maybe who don't even have a post-secondary institution in their community. So it can be like scary when that first comes up for the first time. But we did do a similar presentation to this with the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers. And as far as I know, it was like very well received, and folks really appreciated having this type of information for folks who are working at sexual assault centers, because people are really busy in these fields and we're all like understaffed and overworked and like have a lot going on all the time. So being able to use our own privileges and our own like knowledges and understanding to support other people who might be doing this work and might need a little bit more context was kind of like the basis behind doing this as well. So I think it would just be context and community specific in terms of how much they know and how much they've had to engage with these processes.
Can you just share quickly before Robert presents some other questions, roughly on average for people who haven't taken a look at policies, the average policy at their institution, how long is a policy at a university for regarding this area?
I would say they're all in the similar ballpark, but some are quite brief, a 13-page, maybe upward the higher end 30+ pages, depending on appendices, their own charts, their procedures, but they're not onerous in terms of length. They're onerous in terms of density and text and subtext and clauses referring to clauses, referring to other clauses. There's something that gets lost in the texts are hard to navigate, even though they can be brief.
So it's not a quick reference or an easy reference. You know, some documents you can, what am I supposed to do in this? And you can just refer, but you're likely to be deconstructing a number of things.
And sorry, Hayley, to be fair, some do try to do due diligence around creating a bit of a cheat sheet or a bit of a terminology sheet, a flow chart, a way to sort of engage with it quickly. But to my mind, you're still navigating a full policy, and they can be really difficult to move through.
And that's something I wanted to name too, is that while there might be a section of the policy that's named confidentiality, that doesn't mean that there isn't sections in the policy that also pertain to confidentiality that aren't under that section. So it's actually like trying to read through those things, and there could be like,
or contradict a section.
Or contradict a section. So it's like, I might be looking for the confidentiality section of this particular policy, but I actually think it's helpful to read the entire policy to be able to pick out where those contradictions are, or if there are other places where it talks about confidentiality.
Right. That's very informative. Robert?
I think that this topic leads right into a question that a participant had posed. They asked, is it the intention of the team to disperse this information to the appropriate staff of universities? And what methods are you going to be using for knowledge translation so that it can be used?
Great question. So I have two answers to that. One of the reasons why we started going down this figuring out how to get this into people's hands was we immediately thought, oh, we should do an infographic, or wouldn't it be nice to have a placard that someone could put on their desk when they're working with the survivor that just has sort of these kind of 10 things you might want to just be mindful of making sure are on people's radar. So we do have these ideas in mind of things that are very practical, that folks who are doing supportive work or folks who are working with survivors or survivors themselves could easily pick up. And at this point, we've been in discussion about some sort of very informal report with a lot of visual sort of information that folks can easily look at, like a research brief or a small bulletin type thing that we can not only distribute to organizations who are working with their campus or doing some university supported work, but for folks to use inside of institutions. So it's something that's certainly on our mind, and in fact, we have purposely done the sort of non-academic knowledge mobilization first, in hopes that we could get some of this information out before the sort of peer-reviewed publishing side of the work.
Yeah, and that was really the purpose of this too, is that we wanted this information to be available to folks. So yeah, in terms of like next steps, if anyone does have any suggestions, feel free to email us, because we're definitely open to hearing about more ways that we can make this like readily accessible for folks, because that's exactly what we want and what we intended.
One of the things that I think many people are wondering is, and certainly I'm interested, will there come a time, it would be interesting for a focus group, for lack of better term, of survivors to hear your findings, not necessarily that they're involved in a university process right now, or that they're at a university even, but maybe were at some point, and just to hear their thoughts about what you found.
I think that's a beautiful idea, Linda, and we often in our work, and when we would meet, talked about how important it is to have survivor-centered and driven work, knowing that they're also often tasked with trying to change, these systems and the structures that put these barriers in place. But I don't disagree with you about the need to sort of have survivor-informed perspectives, also keeping in mind that survivors are always at different points in our policy making, decision making. They are, whether we know or not, survivors are always among us. But I do like your idea of intentionally bringing together folks who are survivors and identify as survivors to really do some more informed work around this. And that was actually part of the reason why we weren't participating in the best practices recommendations, because we're not, to replicate or suggest our way is a new best way of doing things could just simply replicate things that are already in place, the potential for unintentional consequences, the potential for different problems might arise. So to constantly just try to recreate a policy that does absolutely no harm, it doesn't really make sense, because we're up against structures and systems that we need them to respond and start to, remove some of those barriers that are inherent in the policies.
Thank you. Robert, is there another question you'd like to share?
Yes, there is. Participant, first of all, said that this has been very helpful to them, and asked, based on the considerable amount of research that's gone into your work, if there is any advice to newly appointed sexual violence coordinators who are engaging in reviews of their organization's sexual violence policies.
Great question. What do you think?
I think from my perspective, and in terms of doing this research, but also working with the policies in a support capacity, I think maybe even engaging in like a similar process that we did of just like reviewing the policy and like trying to find those themes to be able to give this information to survivors that are coming to you. Because I think that's something that, again, was coming up in our work, but also just like when I was doing work as a counselor and advocate, being able to have this information up front for a survivor before they're making decisions about how they would like to proceed is like really important. So I'm not sure if I can provide like advice in terms of like changing policies, but for sure from like a harm reduction standpoint and also from an informed consent standpoint, just know the policy like so thoroughly and understand those themes in the policy and what survivors should know right up front.
I'll just add on quickly, and you might be able to get another question. And the other thing is what Hayley did when she started her new position as a new sexual violence counselor. She really made connections with people inside the university. She sought out people who were sort of already doing this work, whether it be faculty, staff, student groups, people in her already kind of existing networks through the Sexual Violence Center. So I feel like Hayley intentionally created community that could help support her in that role, sort of better learn, not just the policies, but sort of the everyday practices of what it meant to support people inside a university. So find your people. Yeah.
That's massive. Thank you.
Yeah. We really are running out of time.
Oh, I'm sorry. We promised to be short-winded and we weren't.
It's perfectly okay. And I just think that, you know, you talked about the desire and the commitment to do meaningful research and not just research for research's sake.
Sure.
And I think that this is such a wonderful example of that, where your critical analysis really is has an impact for all of those that are wanting to support people that with lived experience of violence and maybe interfacing with a university or a college. And I think that it helps us understand too. I think when we're busy, and I think anybody in a direct service, and you mentioned that, Hayley, it's busy. You know, you're trying to meet needs to the best degree that you can, and to take care of yourself and your coworkers. And I think the time that's required to truly go through and, as you say, cross-reference all of those clauses and the parts of a policy that are referenced, I just think most people honestly don't have that time.
100%.
And the fact that you did that work that we can all benefit from is truly meaningful, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate you taking the time to share your findings with us.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to a Gray report
Yes.
that you're thinking of, and any knowledge translation that publications that you come up with, and also any peer review. We'll follow all of it. So on behalf of all of our participants and our team, thank you both for your presentation today and your work.
Thank you. We were happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Bye. Please don't forget to do the evaluation.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you.